SOS! They're taking us! I hope that this is not just a cry for help, but that we can alert everyone who's going through this abduction process. Many abductees are placed under a hypnosis process, a type of memory suspension, so that there is no memory of these attacks when people are taken from their homes after the experiments and manipulations.
Over time, even as a child, I felt like a little adult. I saw things with different eyes. I suffered more than usual, and I began to understand that other children in the world could be like me, feeling alone, and that they could not trust anyone. Since that day, I started to create an imaginary world of my own, but when I was with my brothers, I lived barely within their reality, with their jokes and mundane conversations. But living together was difficult. I felt out of place from that family group, preferring to play alone, because when I heard that woman's voice in my mind during the day, I pretended I was talking to some invisible friend. That way it was easier to live with my own family and not feel so out of place. In my childhood, it seemed that I lived in duplicity, one life with my parents and siblings at home, and another life with the experiments in that room. When we had a family meeting, and I was in the midst of my cousins and brothers, I didn't care so much about them or the games. It was as if they weren't part of my story, they weren't my real family, and I just waited to return to the experiences in the room, with that woman and the other children, who looked more like me than my own family. Once, when I was 5 years old, I was abducted by little gray beings, and I still remember that sinister abduction. I've started to tell you this before, but now I'm going to tell you in more detail. I lived on the top floor of a building, and on this day, something very strange happened. As usual, my whole family went to bed, and I heard a noise in the living room. The strange thing is that no one from my house got up and went to find out what was going on. It felt like they were all in a deep sleep, but I was awake and scared as I didn't know what was going on. Fear took over me, and I started screaming for my parents and shook my brother, who was in the bed next to me, but he wouldn't wake up. Nobody listened to me. Suddenly, a strong light came through the living room window, and I could see two small gray creatures coming towards me. At this point, I was trying to wake up my brother, so I ran to my bed and covered my head, but I felt something pulling me. I tried to scream again, but I could not open my mouth. These grays took me with them, and I ended up inside a round room where there was a kind of stretcher. They laid me down and began to examine me. I cried a lot and they didn't even care. I moved a lot until one of them, without much effort, touched my arm and made me get stuck on that stretcher through some mechanism. Even so, I could still move and squirm. One of them kept looking into my eyes, and I didn't quite understand what was happening, but I heard his voice inside my mind telling me not to move, that they wouldn't hurt me, but I would have to be quiet. It was impossible. There was no way I could keep quiet or not be afraid of everything that was happening. There was a moment when the ambient light was dimmed. In the place of the stretcher, the light became clearer, and I could see that there were about 4 more grays. Only one of the beings was taller than the others. He approached me, and I was desperate. He came with a piece of equipment that looked like a steel wire and produced a light at the tip. He turned my head to the right, and I started to move a lot until I managed to kick this being's arm. He looked furious and held me by the shoulders, staring into my eyes and trying to get me to sleep. I felt that it gave me terrible sleepiness, but I was strong and did not sleep. He tried 3 times, and seeing that he couldn't control me with his mind, another gray brought a device that was attached to the stretcher, and I remember that a light passed under me like a scanner and started to warm me. I felt like something was almost burning my back, and suddenly, in front of me, I saw my image in the air, rotating 360 degrees, like a holographic projection of my naked body. It was like a 3D MRI, which read my body and projected a holographic image, and as they touched the image to some part of the body, my organs appeared to be working in real time. It was the first time I saw my heart beating, and I didn't even know anything about internal organs. I was just 5 years old. This was giving me despair because I didn't understand anything about what was happening. At one point, they touched the side of my head, which was projected into the image, but they didn't spend much time there. Then they came towards the stretcher and started an intervention on me. The taller gray tried twice more to turn me off, but he couldn't, and it bothered them all. They had trapped me on the stretcher with something that, after a long time I discovered, was a type of oily gelatin which made our limbs not receive the commands of the brain and put us in a process of lethargy, but without losing consciousness. A few very fine strands, as thick as hairs, came out of the stretcher. The smaller grays turned my head and inserted these wires into my left ear. I felt a huge despair and anguish for not being able to move, and I thought I was going to die. I remember crying and screaming, and as the wires went into my ear, I felt a very strong burning. Since I couldn't speak at the time, something reminded me of the woman who took me to the playroom. She had taught me that I should use my mind to manipulate the sphere when I wanted it to come to me. I don't know why it came right away, but with all the strength I had, I ordered them, with my mind, to stop touching me. It was then that they somehow stopped and looked at me. It felt like I had contacted them directly, as if I could speak into their minds, just like the tall gray had done to me before. They started to move faster and fiddled with something in the room. The light in the room began to change color, and one of them placed his hand on the other's head. I could hear them talking, as if they were a single mind or a single voice. They said that I had accessed their collective mind, that the experiment was in danger, and that they could now be accessed by the Ophanim from my mind, and for their safety, because of the law they were breaking, they would stop the experiment, but they needed to mark me for future visits and interventions. At this point, the taller gray came up with that wire, with the light on the end, and inserted something into the cartilage behind my ear. I screamed in their minds to let me go. I felt a force inside me that I didn't know I had, and I could feel everything and access the mind of each of them. I started to see that I was in space, in front of a cluster of stars, and there was a gigantic spaceship. I started to see the other beings that were behind everything, inducing them to do the experiments. These beings looked like reptilians. It was then that a strange sound in the room started to increase, to disturb what I was accessing in their mental network. At that moment, the room began to move. I felt that the more I screamed inside their minds, the more the room turned a little, as if it was going off the level, like a small earthquake. It wasn't until I was a teenager that I understood that the interventions took place inside a laboratory in a spaceship. Because my mind accessed their collective consciousness network, it ended up interfering with the ship as they navigated and piloted from their minds. They quickly returned to me, but at that moment, my movements returned, and I turned my head around. I heard a kind of popping inside my ear, and that was desperate, as I got dizzy and hearing a very loud echo. I felt something running down my neck. It was my blood, coming down from my ear. At that moment, 3 small grays held me. One of them had a device on his wrist that expelled a gas that made me lose my breath. I couldn't stand it any longer, and panic made me black out. When I woke up, I was naked outside my house, near the laundry area. I woke up with a very confused mind and not understanding anything. There was still blood in my ear and neck, but I tried to run inside and hide. Somehow I believed it was a nightmare. I went in and hid under the covers, with a lot of pain in my ear, and I think I passed out again. I woke up the next day with blood on my bed and some kind of yellowish secretion. My mom saw that I had a reddish mark and thought I had some sort of itching all night. She tried to tend to the wound at home for the first few days, but I had an inflammation. She took me to the doctor, and he indicated penicillin, which made my case worse, as I had an inflamed ear for a long time, and the secretion was already affecting my left eye. The situation got worse, and I was taken to the doctor again, who said it was an allergy to penicillin, and at the time, He didn't even do the audiometry test, nor did he suggest doing it at some point. Thereafter, I discovered that I had lost hearing in my left ear. The strange thing was that I began to hear a very thin whistle in this ear, which began to appear at intervals. This caused me panic as I remembered the terrifying moment I had. Those whistles always came when the Greys were close, monitoring me, or just before they abducted me. When I became a teenager, I discovered that there was a chip behind my left ear, which remains in my ear to this day. Once, indignant, I went to try to remove this chip in a surgery clinic, but when they went to anesthetize me, to remove that chip, the lights in the room began to flicker, and then went off completely. The entire building of the clinic was lit normally. The light ended only in the room we were in. At this moment, my ear started to ring very loudly. I panicked and ran out of there, certain that I wasn't going to try this anymore. Whenever I think about touching this device, I'm alerted that they're watching me, so I stopped thinking about it. As an adult, I had an outside help that saved me from some interventions by these Greys, but I'll tell you about that at another time. To be continued.